Good afternoon, and thank you for coming and for this really fascinating discussion, especially capitalism and happiness. I was at lunch today and just was telling people that where I was going this afternoon, and I told them I was going to talk about capitalism and happiness and the pursuit of happiness, and he said. That the founders actually said the original phrase was, it wasn't a pursuit of happiness, it was a pursuit of property, which actually has a lot to do with what, what we're talking about today. Does capitalism work in delivering happiness? And a lot of the early discussions on capitalism and capital had to do with the discussion of property and the value of property and how you allocate capital in different ways. And we know that that capitalist systems are the best for generating wealth, for creating wealth, for allocating capital, all the forms of capital, the free movement of people and ideas and financial capital and resources in the most friction-free ways, responding to what markets want. To where they can be their most productive and create value. But we also know that the fruits of capitalist systems aren't always distributed in the most efficient ways, and there are frequently concentrations, and there are concentrations of fast-moving industries, as we see in recent years. So the question is, what do you do about that? How are people responding to those incentives? What are the consequences for society? And I think firms are struggling to try to deal with these things. We know that with evidence of economic polarization and income inequality, that there are consequences for economics, or consequences for our politics, and firms are trying to grapple with it. They see themselves on different sides of this, trying to be successful, competitive firms in this environment, but also dealing with greater societal needs and responding to what the signals they're getting from all the stakeholders they're dealing with. So, we see things like banks trying to decide whether or not to finance certain activities, and how do you do those? How do you deal with those kinds of questions? Retail outlets on how they respond to the needs of their customers, and that create sometimes controversial choices for them. Firms trying to decide what the needs are of their employees in attracting talent and doing what they can to make sure that they're attracting the talent that they want and need, and training and retaining the very best people, responding to public goods and greater social needs like climate change and other societal needs, understanding the ethics of their customers, their suppliers, their investors, and if you are an investor in the things that you're investing in. These are all big questions. It's manifested itself in some different models of economic organization for firms, things like impact investing, firms that deal with impact investing, B corporations, the creation of firms that have a mission that they want to focus on, things like Tom's Shoes and others who are trying to solve problems with using economic models at the firm level, in addition to a whole range of different responses by firms trying to respond to society's needs. There were some of the great thinkers of economic thinkers, including some of the greatest supporters of free market capitalism, the proselytizers for free market capitalism, had interesting views on these questions in terms of what the role of the firm is in trying to address these issues. If you go back to the Milton Friedman, the Friedman Doctrine, his view was pretty clear. He said there's one and only one social responsibility for business, and that's to create a profit, to be profit maximizers. And we're going to talk a little bit about the way firms think about these kinds of questions with the profit motive and with the structures of the economy today. Very recently, if you saw the letter that Larry Fink, the CEO and chairman and CEO of BlackRock, his letter to CEOs had a very different view of how firms ought to think about where they are in society and their relationship to their communities and their workers and their suppliers and their investors and what their responsibilities are. And we'll just read a couple quotes from Larry Fink's letter. He says, "Indeed, the public expectations of your company have never been greater. Society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a social purpose. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society." He goes on to say that without a sense of purpose, no company, either public or private, can achieve its full potential and will ultimately lose the license to operate from its key stakeholders. So that's a very different view from the Friedman view of being tied very, very closely to a profit motive. If I try to think about the difference between the way Milton Friedman thinks about the role of the firm and its obligation to society and compare it to what Larry Fink is talking about, I would think about it this way. I would say Milton Friedman had a very narrow and bounded view of the role of the firm. Of course, a firm needs to make a profit, but he thought about the incentives only in the terms of what investors desire, and he had when I say a bounded view, he was bounded that the investors' desires were simply to achieve short-term maximum profits. If you think about what Larry Fink is saying, he's saying that firms have a much broader role, and they should not, simply, try to do good in society and do good work and be ethical firms and think about their employers and their customers and their ethical sourcing and their role in society for simple good, although that's a benefit to do it for simple good, but you should do it because that's the signal for what the best firms will do, to be a very successful firm, to attract the best forms of capital, to attract the best talent, to be welcome in societies where you want to operate your business, to create source the very best products for what for your business. You need to actually operate in a way that is very relevant for all of those stakeholders and thoughtful of the desires of those stakeholders. So there is no trade-off between profit and the success of the firm. And it's a much more optimistic role of the firm in society. I think we'll look for evidence on this. I think our speakers today are two people who talk about investing. They look at investing. They actually execute investing. They operate see firms and how they operate and how they play that role in society. And we're going to hear them talk about how it is in a very in not theoretical ways but very real ways. And so we're going to welcome our speakers to the stage. There will be Sonal Shah and Todd Hitt. And I hope I didn't step over the voice of God in helping to announce them. But welcome both to the stage and look forward to their discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Tony. I think we should just let Tony keep speaking. What do you think?
He did a great job. He did a great job setting us up, that's for sure. So how would you like to start, Tony?
I think we're going to go one-on-one. Who wants to kick off?
I'll kick it off. So I think when we talk about capitalism, first off, I have to say that I'm a capitalist. There's no question about that. No one would paint me in any other way. And I think that if I had to say the most important thing I'll say today is that I'm not sure that there is a lot of room between what Friedman said, to take your point, and ultimately what Fink wrote in his letter. Because I think in today's environment, coming out of times of great friction, is that there's really the best way you can be profitable, work your way to profit, is align yourself with society's current needs and what's actually happening today in the marketplace. So attracting good talent, building your brand, making sure that people are hearing you and connecting to what you're trying to achieve. A lot of that comes down to connecting with them. And you're not going to connect with them if you're just focused on profit. You really have to be focused on social impact investing, making a difference in the world, all the things that Larry Fink said in his letter. That's why you have the likes of Warren Buffett, the likes of Jamie Dimon, tremendous capitalists, out on TV now talking about many of these things, that we're going to discuss today.
The problem with this debate format is I'm not sure we're debating, other than probably having a conversation about this. But I think, so while I agree with Tony's original framing that capitalism probably has done the best job of allocating to where capital needs to get to, I think the questions that I have is, yes, society should be thinking about the social impact side of it, but we haven't been. So, yes, Larry Fink's letter is important, and Milton Friedman said what he did, but for the longest time, at least when I was at Goldman Sachs and other places, we were only focused on profit. And we were focused on short-term profit. So did I meet my quarterly goals? And the incentive structures that were set for every banker and for every trader was on a quarterly basis. And how you got promoted and how you received your bonuses was very much based on that too. So the question is, how do we incent into the system itself the way you are promoted, the way you are given your bonuses? It's always just based on how much money you made, not whether you created value, but whether you created profit. And I think what you talked about is value and not profit. And I don't know that we distinguish in the marketplace the difference between value and profit.
And I would agree, and we don't do a good job of educating young students and people coming into the business world. And maybe we're getting slightly better at it now. But ultimately, if you asked a business school student, how do you want your life to go when you get out and get into your first job at Goldman Sachs, whatever great company you're with? Do you want your income to shoot up like a rocket and then come back down the next year and shoot up a little bit more and then come back down the next year and then come back down and then maybe it's down here and then shoot up again? Or would you rather have it look like this? Nice and steady, as you go through your career. I would argue that you'd rather have it be nice and steady. If you're focused on the short term, I think what you get is a lot of this. If you're having to give quarterly guidance and you have to chase the dollar to get to quarterly guidance properly, you're going to get a lot of this. I don't think that's good for anyone in their life to have the rocket mentality, up and down and up and down. And so I think from my perspective, as I look for really long-term investments, I look for owners who are focused on the long term, and I look for governance that's focused on building great companies with great people in it who are going to stay for a long time. So you get sort of that family mentality. And I think ultimately that's how you achieve the greatest profit. And so I think that as a business owner, we're not misaligned with sort of the goals of where society is now. We're not doing a great job of educating people about it, of showing where. You could tell your staff, why don't we count how many jobs we make this quarter, rather than just the profit? Why don't we look at both of those? And then why don't we start to look at what kind of jobs are we creating, right? And you start to get a dialogue going around things like that, and you'll find that there's great excitement in it, because you feel good about it. And again, I'll sort of go back to sort of this rocket mentality that people who work in and around me and with me hear me talk about all the time. You can get really wealthy playing Rocket Man or Rocket Woman. You can get really wealthy, right? And with short-term goals constantly. And you can end up with a castle up on the hill, pretty much all alone, kind of like Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life. And You can get in your car and drive into town, and then one day you get there and you're like, there's no bridge. The bridge is falling apart. You know, I'm supposed to get across this bridge and it's crumbled. It's crumbled because while you were chasing rocket profit and dropping it up and down and not paying attention to the landscape where you work every day, the people that work for you and how they reach out to their communities, their neighborhoods, their states, their country, right? If they're not doing that, eventually you get a real disconnect. And you're going to end up in a castle with no bridge and no way to get to anywhere. So you need to be thinking about, how do I keep that bridge in place? How do I keep it great so I can get back and forth and I can get, on with my life? And that's really what I talk about every day, and that's what I look for when I'm investing.
So, pardon my skepticism on some of this, because I think on one hand, I hear you saying that you're doing, the way you invest is one way, and then I look out in the marketplace and I see, we kept investing in Uber when we knew things were going bad. And everybody talked about how great Uber was. And I'm not complaining about Uber, and I see that they're making the changes, but for the longest time, they were the hottest company everybody was investing in, and everybody was talking about it. And we were bowling over policymakers on the issues because we liked the concept of Uber. And then there's this question of where is the value for society versus where is the value for, did they care about their drivers? Did they care about what they cared about the customers, and clearly they were making it easier for the customers, but did the drivers matter in this case? And I think the question for all of us should be, did the customers ask even those questions? Or were we just happy getting a faster Uber? I think that's a question that we should ask ourselves, but that's one example of the financial crisis, which I know we talked about a little bit before, which is, did we have to get to the financial crisis? Because every report that I had been reading was showing that the mortgage crisis was coming, and people couldn't pay the balloon mortgages that were coming. And yet, every bank was continuing to offer mortgages, even when they knew their customers weren't ready for it. And did the crisis need to happen in order for the banks to pay attention to society? Or will that happen outside of that? And then the third question is, again, I asked this, and you were saying this about your employees and how you ask what kinds of jobs are being created, but are investors really asking those questions? Maybe some of them are, but it's not the conversation. And when I look at the impact investing world, which is the part that I live in, we're asking that question, but still at the end of the day, most of the conferences I go to, we're asking about the financial ROI and rarely asking about whether the social impact was also being met at the same time. So success in impact investing is if you meet the financial ROI. Success isn't actually if we did social good. Or simultaneously asking that question. And it doesn't mean you can't have a company that's running well if they're not making money, but at the same time, we don't ask the other question. So my question back is, how do we get there? Where I think we can do it, but I'm not wholly convinced that we're there until we get to a crisis point.
Yeah. It's a great question, Sonal, and the answer is you're right. We're not there. And it's a long haul to get there. It's not. These things don't change overnight. These structural changes take a long time. Typically what happens when you run into these structural changes, you have a moment of friction. We certainly had that. We had a moment of friction back in 6, 7, and 8. We all lived it. We had a generation come out of that moment of friction with a whole different set of values from, my generation. My generation certainly came out. Short-term profits, let's go play Rocket Man, let's go, get at it. You come out of watching your house get taken away from you and your parents lose their jobs, and you're actually scrounging for the next meal. When you thought 6 months before that, you were sort of middle class, you come out with a totally different perspective on life. And that's a very strong, very purposeful generation that, we're all starting to employ now, and they're starting to impact real social change in the country. That is the largest generation that's coming. That is the customer that we all have. That is the employee we have to attract. So when I say Friedman and Fink, there's no daylight between them. While that might sound a little bit controversial when you're just reading their words on the paper, the truth of the matter is they don't. There is not daylight between those two, because if you don't do these things, you're not going to attract that talent. They're not going to come work for you. Uber had their problems. Fantastic company, obviously, in so many ways. You know, really disrupted, you know, getting around and moving people around. Really great for the price points of getting people around. Talk about capitalism.
Yeah.
I mean, that's capitalism. That's, you know, wow, I can get here to there so much faster and so much more convenient. And I know exactly when I'm going to arrive. I know exactly when I'm going to get picked up, and I can track. All great. But when Uber had their problems, here came Lyft, right? Lyft came along. Lyft started cutting into their margins, cutting into their business, you know. They had to sort of battle the cities at the same time. And, you know, people started to collapse on Uber a little bit. And Uber was forced to change. 35 years ago, Uber wouldn't be changing. We wouldn't have that, you know, that kind of impact. So I do think we're seeing these trends sort of take hold. But let me mention another thing that I think plays a role here. And I think that we're starting to connect those dots a little bit too. And I'm going to go back maybe 15, 18 years, and maybe my mouth's bad, but before the crisis. And I'm going to say that in this country, there was a lot of chasing short-term profits by going and buying companies throughout the middle of the country. Most private equity companies were guilty of it. And, you know, you'd go in and you'd buy a company, you know, in a small town or a medium-sized town in middle America, and you would, change it up, offshore it. Everybody gets fired, basically. You know, the town was living off of, you know, a couple of industries, and one of them all of a sudden disappears. The 2-stoplight town becomes a 1-stoplight town. You know, there's no tax base, there's no employment, right? And there's no solution. So here's a town that's basically in middle America that's effectively gone under, you know, effectively gone bankrupt because we've taken this town and we've offshored all their businesses. Okay, so it's compelling, I think, to think about that. So I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., or New York City, or L.A., right, or Houston, and I'm not really seeing the impact of that immediately. It's not like affecting my job. It's not affecting my day. Maybe I read about it in the Washington Post or see a short news story on it. But now, years later, right, we have people stuck right now all throughout middle America, and we have a labor shortage right now that is the next tipping point for our economy. And maybe you've heard me talk about it on TV, and Sonal, you and I talked about it back there with Tony. That's the next big thing here. When you're down to 62% participation rate, you've got 3.7% unemployment. There's a few jobs, available in certain areas, but no people to fill them. And then there's jobs available, you know, in other areas, less people to fill them. People want to work in some areas. There are no jobs there. That's what I think we really need to be talking about, because we can talk about interest rates and, your return's going to go down and your cap rates. That's boring stuff. That's math. You could do that on a napkin with your coffee in the morning, right? And say, okay, so I'm worth $500,000 less this week, or, my house went up. The real compelling stuff is, where are we going to find these workers? Where are we going to find people to rebuild our infrastructure? Where are we going to find people to fill jobs in Omaha, Nebraska, and Youngstown, Ohio, where their needs are? How are we going to solve an opioid epidemic that we're having right now? Because there's no jobs there and no real chance for those people to think about, what is the American dream for me? What's the American dream for me? What does that look like? Because they don't see it. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, there's so much in that one, in those sets of comments. But so let's just start with the jobs. I think it's so interesting on the jobs, right? Because the question is, and you raised it, is in some cases people aren't moving. Because I lived in San Francisco. It's almost impossible to live in San Francisco because $400,000 salary does not get you a place to live at $7,000 a month. And you can't buy a place because the minimum place in Palo Alto costs $3 million just to break down to build to put the next $3 million in to rebuild the house. So people where the jobs might be may also be where they can't afford to live. So this is a question, DC is facing the same question of how do we attract workers for jobs, but there's no place for them to live and the travel times are too long for them to get there. Our transportation system doesn't actually meet the demands of where people are. Originally, when we created transportation in Washington, DC, it was to get people to be able to get to the places they want. But the the recent data shows that the people that end up living closest to the metro stations are the people that can afford the expensive housing. So you can't really live further out and come in on time and get to work on time because there's all these questions that we should ask. So I think there's this question of how do you have community support, family support, and still be able to get to a job in case you don't have anything else to fall back on. So if you are middle income, and a lot of my family comes from that, they live in Houston because there's a support network there for them, that in case something happens, they can stay there and somebody can take care of us or other types of things. And it doesn't exist if you have to move unless your family's moving with you. And so how do we think about jobs and where they are to where people want to come? So that's one piece of the jobs piece, and there's a lot more in there, so I'm simplifying the process of it. The second part is, I know others are working, Steve Case and others are thinking about rise of the rest and where companies can get created, but where's the capital that is allowing for those companies to get started? We're all depending on private equity capital, or what used to be banks providing capital, long-term debt capital, is now private equity, which is frankly a lot shorter term than long-term debt capital. And are we willing to have that conversation on how to have long-term capital investing in communities that are going to take more time? By nature, it's going to take more time. And are we willing to build value in those companies? I know you're in the equity investment business, but 3 to 5 years is not a long period of time. 5 to 7 years is not really a long period of time. I've worked a lot in the international development space and international investing space, and 10 years is about the right time for something to grow over a period of time, but nobody wants to invest for 10 years. Everybody wants to invest in 3 to 5 and exit in 10. And the question is, how are we thinking long-term, building those systems, in my mind, into the long-term, and then training the next generation while everybody thinks that they want the curve that you were talking about, earning money at this rate. When they get in the jobs, they compete. So we're all competing for this rate. How do I make sure I'm on the top for next year? Maybe I'll miss the next year, then how do I get back on top in the following year? So how do we, I don't know, is it a training question? Is it an incentive question? But what is it that makes us not think about long-term growth, but always thinks about how do I meet the bonus for this next year? And in order for me to stay in that job, I need to meet the bonus for that following year. So every business school student wants to do well in the long term, but every business school student goes into the job that is like, how do I do the rocket ship thing?
Yeah. That's true.
And so what are we doing about that allows those business school students that want to go in the long term have a career in the long term and not just on the rocket ships?
I think all great points and a lot in it. Well, let me sort of address the last point first, because I have some ideas on that. And I think most of this ultimately comes down to education and leadership. And when I say leadership, it's broad. It's a broad term. You need leadership from business. You need leadership from state and local government. You need leadership from federal government. You need it in all areas, and you need them working together to solve structural issues that are impacting our social economy right now. So I would say there's these things called historic tax credits. I don't know if any of you have heard about them before, but let me just show you real quickly how they work. So you could go in and buy an historic building, and maybe you're going to get a 5.5% return on it. You look at it, I can renovate it, I can rent it out, I'm going to get a 5.5% return. That's not all that compelling. You're like, well, that's not so great. Maybe I should go somewhere else with my money. But then there's this tax credit that you get. And if you go in and you renovate it and you keep it for 10 years, you get like a 3-point bump in a tax credit. Okay, now all of a sudden I have an 8.5% return. If you keep it for 15 years, right? You get another bump in the tax credit. Now you get a 7% bump. Oh, now I've got a 12% return. And if you keep it for 25 years, there's another bump. Right now, that's the only tax credit that I know of that's a multiple tax credit that actually makes me get up in the morning and think, can I find one of these things? Can I find something like this? And there's no area where things are more aligned. You have an historic building in downtown Richmond. Everybody wants to preserve it, do something cool with it. You can bring $3 or $4 million in and buy it and put $3 million into it. and get this return for thinking long term. So I would argue that we need to be doing that in all areas of our economy. And when you talk about the labor shortage, and we were having this discussion a little bit before we came out here with Tony and Sonal, having this discussion about when it comes to training right now, there's nowhere to train this generation and existing generations that are in the workforce for the next economy. And by the way, it's coming. The digitization of our economy is coming, and it's moving really fast. K through 12 school is going to change. College, the way we teach college is going to change dramatically. Jobs are going to change. Entry-level jobs are going to change. The amount of time you spend in school, how you do it, it's going to be super flexible. You know, you may not be going to classrooms like this anymore, like I did at Econ 101 at the University of Virginia with 400 people in it. You know, it may be that you're doing it on a teleprogram, where you're doing it, and you're getting through the program that way. You're able to talk to the teacher. All those things are going to happen, and it's all going to happen really fast. And so we need to be thinking about how we're going to train people to fill those jobs that are coming. And I think that we go back to this tax credit, issue. Again, leadership from the federal government, leadership from the state and local governments, leadership from business, creating incentives to get you to invest long-term in training so that, if you keep your money in a training center, for a long period of time. And let me just give this example because we talked a little bit about it. If I go to train someone to work in one of my businesses right now, or a business that I own, it's just an expense. I expense it. It's $800,000, and so I expense it, and there's no bump in tax credit for me. There's no incentive for me to go do that. The only reason I train is because I need the workers. And a single company has a lot of trouble scaling training. So I'm going to train 800 people. It'd be so much more compelling if I was training 20,000 in 5 centers across the country and participating with other people. It'd be cheaper to do. And then if you gave me for my costs, the capital that I contributed to that training center, like one of those multipliers on long-term credits. So instead of just a dollar for dollar expense, I get maybe a 1.3, multiplier on it. So I'm now saving money by doing this. And if I keep it in for 10 years, right, maybe it's 1.4. All these things are the kind of things that in a capitalist society we can do to incentivize people to be really smart and think long-term. So that would be sort of the route I would take. Yeah. It's a complicated route because a lot of people have to work together to get that done. It's not just the lone business person. But I can tell you, strapping together a lot of businesses in an industry is a hell of a lot more powerful than one business going it alone. Heck of a lot more compelling about how you solve a problem and better ideas, from everyone in those different businesses in the industry, rather than one person at the top of one large company. Big difference.
I 100% agree there. But I think that the interesting question for me, and the way I think about this is, one, it really requires everybody thinking about their jobs differently. So if you're in government, how are you thinking about solving a problem, not regulating an industry? So we get into the space where when I was in government, we were all regulating, and we weren't actually thinking about what's the problem we're trying to solve and who else needs to be at that table to come to the best outcome possible. So if we are trying to do job training, what's the best way of getting there? Who needs to be at the table? Because we actually don't trust each other. The business community doesn't trust the government, and the government doesn't always trust the business community because everybody thinks they're coming in there to sell something. But there is this question of how to solve these problems. And you gave one example on the job training. I have one that I've been following in Australia, New Zealand, where the government runs a public-private partnership. So, in New Zealand, much like the United States, prisons are privately run and operated. Now, just to understand how a prison is operated, it runs like a hotel room. The more people you have in there, the more cost-effective it is. So the incentive for the operators is to put as many people in as possible because it's a per cost in the room. So what New Zealand's decided is that we're going to pay for a prison, and you're going to get paid to reduce recidivism. So the fewer people that come in, the more you get paid. So it changes the way we think about solving the problem. Instead of saying, how many more people do I put into the prison? Now I'm saying, how many more people can I keep out of the prison and keep from coming back into the prison? And the company that now operates it is going around the world and saying, who's closing down prisons and how do we close down a prison? Right? Nobody thinks that way here. So how do you think about, so this question is, how does the public and private think differently about what their jobs are? And how do they think about solving problems in a new way where one, we've always seen as the government as in one role and the private sector in the other role, but I think there's this merging of how can the public and private really actually solve for something, and what are the right incentives to help people solve those problems in our communities. And the part that I don't think we talk about enough, and I certainly don't talk about enough, is where does civil society hold us responsible to make sure we're solving that problem? So it shouldn't just be a social media Twitter campaign, but can there be a better way to hold responsibility to, is the problem getting solved? Otherwise, you can get collusion between government and the private sector and not get to the solution of the problem. So that's one, and it's also why I think impact investing, and I know you work with the Just Capital and the Conscious Capital groups, is thinking about how can we create the next generation of businesses that are holding equally both the social impact and the for-profit, and holding ourselves accountable to the social impact side of the for-profit, figuring out the incentive structures that allow us to, whether it's Revolution Foods that creates healthier food in school lunches. How many of you have ever had a school lunch? Great, right? Right, exactly. Not so great. And 2 women come out of college saying, why should school lunches be crappy? And why can't we make a healthier school lunch and rethink it? They actually went to Aramark and all these companies that serve these school lunches and said, can we help you do it differently? And they're like, no, we've got this business model down. They go to business school and they're like, we need to compete with that business model and come up with a new business model. And now they're competing at HI. They've gotten the Houston Independent School District contract, the LA Independent School District contract. They're in Louisiana Independent School Districts. And they're starting to compete around the country and saying, we're going to provide healthier meals in schools. But somebody had to make a bet on them for long-term capital. And that capital actually came from foundations. The foundations put the long-term capital in and saying, we want you to test this model out. We're going to take the risk on you. It didn't come from the private sector by itself. And then Revolution Investment and others put money into it. But it frankly took Rockefeller Foundation and other foundations to put some of the capital in order to make Revolution Foods succeed. So how do we get more of those? Because I do think that's where, at least the students I teach at Georgetown and some of the other places, they care about that. They want those businesses. They're trying to find those businesses. And then the question that they run up against, which we find out with Revolution Foods, is can the government contract differently so they can compete for those contracts and not just go to the usual suspects of Aramark and the wonderful food we're already eating in our cafeterias. So I think this question is, can we find a way, in my view, how do we elevate, escalate, make faster that process of investing in those types of companies that might challenge the status quo? All of them aren't going to win, but in the same way that Alta Vista didn't beat Google. All of them aren't going to win, but how do we, do you all even know what Alta Vista is? Right? There's
like 2%.
Right, exactly. That's how fast technology is moving. But in the way that, Alta Vista wouldn't have beat Google, but maybe Revolution Foods is not the only one, but there are 10 other companies that start competing with Aramark for better food options in schools. Or Tom's shoes. How do we get more of those? Because, why shouldn't we be helping others with shoes while at the same time buying shoes? Or any of the multiple companies that are out there, but there's just not enough in my view. I hope there's more.
Yeah. That's all great points. So I have sort of a question for you. So my view of this, and hopefully I've made it somewhat clear today, is that we need to be incentivizing private business, big and small, to think about long-term investing. I mean, that's been a little bit of a theme of our discussion today, right? And I think when you're incentivized to think long-term, and there literally are marks where you're like, okay, I go that long in X and I go that long in Y. I think that changes the dynamic.
Right.
It just changes the dynamic of everything you do, right? So I would ask you, what do you think that looks like? I mean, how do we get to a point where structurally we have these incentives? The very thing, because you work in this world some, the very thing that Jamie Dimon and Warren Buffett, by the way, 15 years ago, if you were Jamie Dimon and Warren Buffett talking about not giving quarterly guidance, there would be hell to pay. And for them to go on CNBC together and do it together like that,
right.
And kind of tag team CNBC, I mean, that was a moment in history that I never thought I'd see. I think it's brilliant. I was excited that morning when I saw them talking about that. So now we have a question of how do we do it, right? What are your thoughts on that? Do you have some ideas about that?
So two thoughts, not solely well-formed, but one, I think for long-term investing, we should think beyond just equity funds and thinking about funds. Maybe it's a holding company structure, maybe it's a different structure that allows us to do some long-term investing in businesses that are continuously growing but may not have the hockey stick returns immediately. So how, what's the structure that allows for long-term? And then the question is 2 and 20 the right structure? Or should we be thinking about other incentive structures for investors that allow for long-term thinking, that then can create the values that we can in the companies and allow them to push for value creation within the companies in the long term. So I think of Jeff Bezos as one of those examples, although he, we think of Jeff Bezos today, but he took a big risk when he started, and he was in the black for a long time. I mean, in the red for a long time before he came into the black, and his bet was, I'm gonna get 100 million customers because that's the bet I wanna make, and that's gonna be important. But that took somebody to make a bet on that long term, and he continues to make those bets in his own company where he's testing out products even though they're loss leaders at the beginning. So how do we think about that in society that might not be just one big company that has the ability to take that risk now? Can we think about long-term investing that allows for those incentive structures to be slightly different?
So I think that's all great. Now, here's another thing that I'd say that I think is important. We've all heard about the global economy. You hear it all the time. It's commonplace. It's 15 years ago they started, we're in a global economy, and it was all of a sudden something new to everybody. And I was thinking, well, we've always sort of been in one. It's just that we talk about it, now more. But with digitization, the global economy is going to come right down on top of us. I mean, it's really going to be, now you're going to see that shift. You're going to see that shift where goods and services are right on top of you, literally, from all around the world. And I would argue that we do a poor job right now in this country of thinking long term. And when the global economy comes down on top of you through digitization and technology, right, that's going to put us at a disadvantage. I mean, a real disadvantage if we're not thinking long term. So you think about, the Chinese, fantastic industrious society, out working real hard. They go into Africa. They're investing all through Africa because they have long-term goals, because they're not a capitalist model, right? So they can think really long-term, hundreds of years if they choose to, right? We struggle to do that. We don't have a lot of companies in Africa controlling mining rights and doing those kinds of things that ultimately will pay off down the road when you're controlling huge amounts of mineral rights around the world with the very kinds of minerals that we're using to build things with, right? If we don't get ahead of this curve, right, we'll fall behind. And so I think now is the time to be evangelizing about this. And I think you're hearing it now. You're not just hearing it from me. It's out there. That we need to start thinking about how to put government, private sector, big business, small business, strap it together and start thinking long term. And we need to build some structural elements into our economy, right, that incentivize that. That's where I think you're going to see these next trends coming, in that world. Because ultimately, it's in our American DNA to attempt to win, to always put our best foot forward to win. It's just like it's in our DNA to move. You're all here for a reason. It's because somebody picked up and went across some kind of body of water, right? Or, came across a border. So to me, all these things are sort of who we are. It's in our DNA. And I'm hoping that we can spur some of that, Sonal. We can spur some of that change in thinking.
Yeah, are you coming up for questions? So my one comment is agree, and for all of the young people in the audience, I certainly hope that you all will think long-term and push the companies that you go work for to think more long-term. Just to give you an example, in Blackstone, before they started doing their impact investing stuff, it was a group of young people within the company that banded together, that did all the research, and went to the senior management and said, we need to be doing more of this, and it led to a change in that. So I think you all need to push us because the system by itself is not going to get pushed, and y'all are the workforce of the future, and everybody wants you to stay. So push us to do that, and I think it's super important. I hope more people go work in government because it takes this type of thinking in government to think about how do we think long-term and how do we solve some of those problems. It's too easy to just be on the outside and saying government should do X, but it requires people to go into government and also make that change. And I hope some of you, both younger and older, will think about going into government because it requires new thinking. It really does. It requires the government to be pushed too and not be uncomfortable in that portion of it. And then finally, be creative on solutions. Don't, just because of what you see and that's what we did in the past, that's not good enough. I mean, if digitization's coming, and it is coming, there are no solutions right now. I mean, everybody's making up shit. So anyone that tells you that they have an answer for it, sorry, I should probably monitor myself. There's no answer for it. So make up, be in the process of creativity. Don't be in the process of what did the past hold, because the past is changing fast.
Well said.
Questions? If
all the hard ones are for him, and I'm only taking the easy ones.
I think one right here, and then I'll make sure we get you up in the balcony.
Hi, my name is Grace. I work at the State Department, and before my time at the State Department, I was an entrepreneur. And I'm really interested in bringing in some socially conscious entrepreneurs and making some private partnerships really happen on key issues that we care about. There are very frustrated people right now within government who are now just being, they feel like they now have to leave to make bigger impact. But a lot of people are territorial. A lot of people don't want to take risks because it's very tough to be in that position to become an entrepreneur. So I guess my question is a little more about institutional change and how do we sort of make the right allies. As a young Asian person, how do I tap into someone who has a different social capital or I guess political capital to make that happen? So how can someone like, I guess me or someone else at the government or in the private sector who want to make those impacts and want to make those partnerships happen, I guess make the right allies, and how does that happen? So thank you.
That's a great question. Grace?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I think there are places within the State Department that you should get to know, whether it's in the partnerships office or some of the other offices, that you should build some of those allies, but also build allies on the outside. Who are the people that you can work with? I can only give you an example from when I was in government. What we used to do is we used to allow all of the people doing interesting things to come in and come meet with us because they don't always know that the government cares. And some portion of it is just opening up yourself to just showing that the government cares and letting them know that you care about it. Maybe you can't do anything about it right now, but you're building a network of people when you can do something about it that you have the ability to do. The second is finding people like you who care about those same things. We used to create a little innovation network within government that we would all just get together and saying, what are you doing? How are you doing it? And some of it was small stuff that nobody cared about. And some of it was big enough stuff that people did care about, but the small stuff was the stuff that was actually more interesting half the time because you could kind of jujitsu and try little things that nobody pays attention to because nobody cared about it, and it wasn't something the secretary cared about or the deputy secretary cared about, but you got to play around in small ways. So finding those people along the spectrum that will be your allies to do that. And what I thought about when I thought about allies was not always the people that were exactly what I was doing, but the lawyers that wanted to do things slightly differently, the contract writers that wanted to do things slightly differently. So your allies may not be your typical analysts or your typical deputy assistant secretaries or deputy secretaries. It might actually be there are different people at different places, but they all have a piece of making that change happen. And so build those allies now, because when you can do it, you'll be prepared to do it. But in the meantime, if you just wait for political change or other changes, that's not good enough. Like, you need to have enough people ready to do that. And find some of the people in the past who have done it and find out how they did it, because they know the system well enough to figure out how to change it. And I think John Heffern's here. He was an ambassador in Bratislava? Armenia, and knows some of that. So find people like him who can be allies for you and help you think through that too.
Thank you so much. I'd love to also follow up with you after.
Yeah, please do.
Let's go to the balcony, and then we'll come over to this side.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
My name's Shelley. I am an investor. I love looking at companies and what they're doing and how they're doing it, and new ways of doing things. I do see a lot of resistance, though, in some of the state companies that we see in our economy. And what
Todd, you
I
have
mean,
a-
I'll take that. I mean,
Profit. I am all about profit, but
yeah. I mean, I'll take that. I mean, I think ultimately transparency is the key to that. You know, I mean, just the word's got to get out about these things. People have to be talking about it more than ever. I mean, you're dead on. There are companies out there making no money whatsoever. There are companies out there losing money. And there's one that, you know, just got taken off the Fortune 500 list or the Dow list, right? You know what I mean? Yet
Not to be named.
Yet not to be named, which, by the way, is a great American company and will continue to be a great American company. Will likely be back on the, you know, on the industrials. But to me, that word getting out, because that CEO certainly made some money. So I think that word getting out, it's the democratization and transparency of these kinds of things, and you're really dead on. It's an embarrassment that it works that way. And by the way, I'm a capitalist, but you should be tied, boards need to make sure, right, that compensation is tied to long-term performance. And it should be really focused on long-term performance, not short-term performance. Because that's what happens in a lot of these situations. You could have 2 good quarters, 6 terrible ones, and for those 2 good quarters, because you hit certain benchmarks, you earn certain options. It's not about your salary. You don't get a salary. It's about your options, right? And then, you know, you can go 10 years and bankrupt the company and still have options, you know, and pick them up as you go, you know, as you vest. Pretty absurd, actually. So, you know, you need to in that case, eyes need to be turned to the boards, right? And this stuff needs to be publicized. And I mean, there are some companies doing that now. Right. You know, it used to be only a shareholder ever saw this information or ever knew. And it used to be they'd only know it if they went to the shareholder meeting, right? Now there's websites that produce it. I'd love to see the media get on top of that, because here's one of my pet peeves. Big business is largely, and small business, they're largely great actors, great character, you know, hardworking, focused, ethical, all these things, right? But the 1 or 2 bad actors are the ones that get picked up by the media constantly, right? And so everybody gets cast, you know, into sort of the bad apple syndrome, right? And so from my perspective, I think it's important to make sure we paint real conscious capitalists, you know, is that we spend time talking about them too. And then making sure that when we have these kinds of things happen, like happened with a great bank like Wells Fargo, you know, a great bank, you know, the kind of things that went wrong there, or the kind of things that went wrong at a GE, that, you know, that it's publicized and that you really talk about it and there's a conversation about it. It's about transparency, I think, ultimately, because I think you're dead on. It's embarrassing. I agree.
Should I get the question here?
Sure. So my name is Richard. I'm the Chief Impact Officer and co-founder of Clean Choice Energy. But I've also been an angel investor, as well as involved in venture and philanthropic efforts. And one of the things I've noticed when you're talking about the long-term horizon and the returns that people are looking at, I think there's some assumptions. You talked about challenging 2 and 20. I want to hear your thoughts a little bit on the traditional venture model of the 10-year horizon, of the 5-year out, the 5-year return. We've seen many early-stage impact investors actually be family offices and single-sponsor funds that are willing to have the patience to stay in a company that may generate tremendous value. At the same time, we're watching in Silicon Valley, companies are staying private much longer. You're not seeing the return of capital to early employees and angels who might reinvest it into the space. So there could be some downsides of long lockups. So I want to hear your thinking about, if you want to change the long-term horizon investing in venture, do you extend the lockup with LPs? Is that something LPs could be open to through the argument that we need to invest in long term? And what are maybe the negative consequences or downsides you could see if money's held up or it's not being recycled, and some of the challenges?
I love this question. It really gets at the incentive of investment.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on in that question, and I think and Todd's going to probably have a more thoughtful answer to this than I am. But let me just start with, I think it is right when you have a venture capital and you have LPs come in and it's a 10-year fund, they want their exits also. They're not coming into a fund because they were in it for 25 years, right? And it's certainly not what these funds are created for. It's why I'm asking whether maybe that's the wrong structure. And maybe we should be thinking about a blended capital model that allows for both debt and equity investments, and that allows those that want to take. So we're seeing in some places, foundations come in at some portion of the capital where they're taking the risk portion of the capital and they're in for the long term. That allows the LPs and others to sit on top of it, but it requires a different model of investment that we haven't really been creative about, and frankly, foundations aren't the risk takers in yet. There's a few that take about 0.00001% risk. But honestly, in my view, that's what foundations and others should be doing, because they should be the risk capital in some of this. But how do we create different structures that allow layers to come in that may not just be the companies? But your point, the other point, which is super important, and I'm not even addressing, is the companies that are staying private for longer. And a lot of people go into those companies thinking that there's going to be an exit at some point. So what are they giving up, and how do you think about it in those terms? I don't know the answer to your question. I would say I hope we can open up this conversation for how do we build long-term structures, and what does it look like, and how do we also give incentives to employees that are not just based on stock options that allow that to happen. So I think that's a great question. I don't have an answer to, but I do think we should open up that conversation more.
Todd, could I add one more flavor in that also? And that's just the role of one of the biggest sources of capital right now are institutional investors and their incentives and their desires on how they think about what the investment time horizon should be for firms.
So first off, when you talk about venture capital, see, from my perspective, I've been investing forever. Investing is investing.
Right.
I don't care what I'm investing in. I don't care whether I'm investing in a restaurant, or somebody who's making that chair or that screen, or it's going to be, a new way to predict the weather. Okay? It's investing. The interesting thing about venture capital is they sort of think there's one way to do it, which I've never understood. But go out to Silicon Valley and start talking about, well, let's look at a different structure. And here's the way I invest. It's kind of like pigs are flying. Do you know what I mean? I mean, literally, everybody looks around the room like, what's going on? I think you're dead on. I think there's no one way, right? Why multiple ways of doing venture capital investing. If you ever run into some of my staff from Kiddar, they'll tell you, I preach this all the time, that there's no one perfect way to invest in any single industry. Never. And in fact, you get better investments, you get better companies, right? Better outcomes, long-term and short-term, right? Long-term and short-term, when you have multiple ways of doing it. Because ultimately, you'll find a match. You'd be like, oh, I think my company's more like a 15, 20-year horizon. I really need long-term capital. Well, here's someone who does that, right? And by the way, it's not institutions, for that matter. The institutions are sometimes part of the problem.
Yeah.
That they literally check these boxes and will invest, right? I mean, and you understand because of a scalability model, that's the path they need to go, right? So I guess what I'd say is no one model, right? I've even discussed, and again, it's quite controversial, the idea of indexing a venture capital fund. I mean, why not? Why can't I index a venture capital fund? Why can't I bring in an LP in the 4th year? And I mean, try talking about that in front of a bunch of venture capitalists. And I mean, literally, I get booed off stage, and it's okay because I've got thick skin. So, but why couldn't you index it?
Right.
What you went in with a valuation, right? You're in that world. You go in with a valuation. You had a methodology for how you valued it, right? Boom. All right. Well, I'm going to keep valuing it based on that methodology, and I'm going to index my LPs as they come in. So it's going to cost more if you come in year 3, more in year 5, or it's going to cost less.
Right.
But at least you're opening it up. I'm for more opportunities, more different ways to do it. It creates better competition and new ideas. And you don't have a lot of that in the venture world right now.
Thank you very much.
Did I answer your question?
That was actually great.
Okay, great.
I think I'm getting the red flashing wrap. I think I need to wrap. But can we listen to the last question? Excellent. We're going to get the last question, and then I'll wrap.
2 seconds. My name is Courtney Strauss, and I work at J.P. Morgan for Jamie Dimon, so thank you for your comments. But I'm also from a one-stop town, and I'm curious to know what you're hearing and what you think the solution is to help these small towns, and I'm talking sub 25,000, 50,000 people. Is the solution digitization, education, and if so, do you see or predict the migration from these rural areas to more urban centers to where, because I think this is obviously, has resulted in the election, and it just underpins everything that's going on in our country.
Disenfranchisement, inequality, one-stop towns are often now becoming no-stop towns. All those things. And I'm going to let Sonal take a big chunk of this, but I'm just going to say that we need to really be capitalizing on this idea of enterprise zones. You know, we can go in and bring jobs to places where there are no jobs, but there are people, right? So that we don't see middle America completely gutted and everybody moving to urban cores, which by the way, has its own whole set of problems that I won't go into, that are not easily solvable. It's much easier to bring a job to an enterprise zone, right? But unlike the tax credits that I talked about earlier, they're not well publicized. Nobody really knows they're out there. There's no real leadership from federal, state, and local government to sort of get us going in that direction, you know? Heck, we can't even rebuild our infrastructure. We can't even, you know, we can't even pass an infrastructure bill to rebuild our infrastructure in this country, which is ranked 16th or 17th in the world, which is a bit of an embarrassment, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of coordination issues, but I'm going to let Sonal take the last piece of this.
So I think the thing he's talking about is the opportunity zones, which is in the legislation. So how do we better leverage them, and how do we think about them since all the governors have set those spaces? I also think that we're going to have to challenge our notion of how small towns are going to be able to remain, and whether there might be centers of which towns can work together on that, because I'm not wholly convinced every town, every 25,000 sub 25,000 town competing for each other is also not the answer. And so I think we need smarter, creative, more solutions to think about how can we create hubs in areas where people can stay within those towns but still have jobs within driving distance. I don't think it's going to be every town is going to succeed the same way. I don't think we're honestly having that conversation. I think we're assuming that every rural town is going to remain exactly the same, and I don't think that's a fair statement. So I think to some extent we need to have a more honest conversation about that and open up the conversation to those communities to say, how do we think differently about inviting companies to come, you know, through opportunity zones or through other places to come operate here, and what is it going to take? But the community also needs to be a part of that conversation, not we've given up all the tax credits and now everything's given and we don't have that conversation with the community. So I think there's a lot that can be done there. I just don't think that the answer is going to be simply that every town's going to get restored the same way. So I just think we should be honest with ourselves to some extent.
It's a good answer. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I'm going to thank Todd and Sonal
well
also.
Done.
And just,
Fantastic.
I think
Well done.
some of the big takeaways that I get from this is that generating the profit is important. It's desired by everyone, but thinking about the stakeholders, all the stakeholders, is critically important for firms to be successful and to meet the desires of the communities, the employers, the employees, and all the stakeholders in a firm. But we're probably not doing that enough right now. We still have a long way to go in meeting that challenge. The challenge for workers is, it is going to come down to things like education, training, and mobility. They're big challenges. We need to find really good solutions for them. We need the business sector, we need firms and government working together to try to find better ways, as I think both Sonal and Todd said, trying to find really smart partnerships on policy between the business sector and government, and trying to find new creative ways of thinking about meeting those challenges will be really important. I loved where this ended up, also talking about communities. As someone who comes from southwestern Pennsylvania, where we've seen the deterioration of a lot of communities that probably are never going to come back in the way that they were, thinking about what their challenges and their aspirations for the people who are there, what that means for them, and being honest with them and helping them make a future for themselves and their children. So thank you both, Sonal and Todd, for a wonderful discussion and for the really excellent questions. Thank you.
So just before we wrap up, I just wanted to thank all of our speakers throughout the day who joined us. I want to thank everybody who was tuning in on Facebook Live for joining us for this inaugural By the People set of dialogues. There's a lot that I took away from the 4 conversations today. I mean, just understanding that there's an actual linkage between what we can learn about how our treatment of indigenous people and how we're exploring outer space for other life forms. The fact that we can have an Israeli and a Palestinian sit here together and talk about how we're going to actually help each other publish each other's books in our respective countries, I think is something that I've never seen anything like it before. We've learned that we can actually, maybe the future of capitalism is doing well and by doing good, and doing good by doing well, and the fact that actually thinking about combating major 21st century challenges is part of the capitalist model. And also thinking about how online worlds can actually provide happiness just perhaps as our real world relationships can. So, but the one key takeaway that I've taken, and I hope that everybody takes home with them, is that this kind of discourse, these kinds of conversations amongst people who come from vastly different backgrounds with different kinds of expertise is a critical part of understanding the world we live in and making it better. And it's not personal. It's about having a conversation with somebody you might normally not have and actually becoming a better person for it. And that is a path forward. And I think that was what we've accomplished today. One performance I would like to highlight for tonight as part of our By the People event, which is taking place throughout the city over the course of the next 3 days. It is going to be the National Cathedral, Union Market, all over town, U Street Music Hall. The National Cathedral tonight is going to be having a performance by Nick Cave, who's an absolutely incredible artist. He is going to be projecting his art under the rose window, and which will be complemented by Jason Moran, who is the Kennedy Center's artistic director, jazz director. And it's a one-night only performance tonight at 8 p.m. at the National Cathedral. It'll be your only time in your life to be able to see something like this. Definitely check out bythepeople.org for all of the other performances, but tonight, 8 p.m., National Cathedral. Don't miss it. Thanks again, everybody, for coming, and have a great day.